We have spent tens of millions of dollars you pursuing
Joe
Biden, and you have not
true.
identified
a
single
lie.
crime.
You are
Really?
lying. That
Really?
is a lie. We have not spent $10 million.
Hey, how much have you spent?
We haven't spent hardly anything.
Oh, it's been for free. Okay. All right. Well, in any event, you know what? Then we get what we paid for it because you got nothing. You got nothing on Joe Biden.
No. Answer
You've
this
not
question.
named a single
this
crime.
question.
No,
what did the Bidens do? What business were they in? Why did they get
can I answer
millions
that?
and millions of dollars?
Well, no, I would like
Can
to
I
ask you a
answer what
question.
it
No,
is?
you start. What did the Bidens do?
I don't know
What
who you're
business
talking
were they
about.
in?
Well, what business is the Comers in? You're talking about lots of people. There's lots of people in the family.
I'm a farmer.
Your
I have land. I lease land. I sell honey.
investigation must identify
What did
a
the
high
Bidens
crime and
do?
misdemeanor.
What did they do?
I'll
for
tell
the
you what Joe
millions of
Biden
dollars?
did. He was a senator of the United States. Then he wrote a book, and he said he made the most money he ever made in his life, millions of dollars on his book, and he gave $1 million
That's
away
what
to
his
charity.
family did. That's
what
That's why Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Romania, China, Russia. That's why they paid the Biden family money, because of Joe Biden.
None of those governments paid anyone any money.
Somebody needs therapy here, but it's nobody on our side of the aisle, okay?
Because
no,
back to the
honestly,
China hearing. Back to the China
you
hearing.
had your chance.
Order,
I would
order.
like my time restored.
No, your time was
I would like
expired.
you-
I've
no,
given
you
3 extra
interrupted
minutes.
me. I want my
No,
time
you
restored.
had your time. You went above, and I let Miss Thornton go a minute.
You know what?
Here, sit down, everybody. Come back. This is about China. We asked a simple question. No, Miss Presley, you're out of order. Sit down.
Mr. Chairman,
You're out of order.
Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman.
Our investigation has revealed how Joe Biden knew of, participated in, and benefited from his family cashing in on the Biden name around the world. The White House is seeking to block key testimony from current and former White House staff. It's also withholding thousands of records from Joe Biden's time as vice president.
Gentleman's time has
President
expired.
Biden must be held accountable for his lies, corruption, and obstruction.
You know, the reason mysteries are called whodunits is because they start with a crime, and then you have to try to figure out who did it. The Biden impeachment investigation isn't a whodunit, it's a what is it? It's like an Agatha Christie novel where the mystery is what's the crime? And that gets very tedious very fast. Now, it's true Chairman Comer has collected a mountain of evidence over the last 11 months, tens of thousands of pages of documents, dozens of hours of interviews with government officials, but all of it clearly shows that Joe Biden committed no crime. Even their own witnesses that they called to the only public hearing they had said there is not remotely enough evidence to justify impeachment. Chairman Comer has bragged on Fox News about procuring 100% compliance with his subpoenas. So forget about obstruction, which I hear them muttering about today. You know, we've had conversations in committee before about carjacking. The maximum penalty for carjacking someone in Washington is 40 years. Kentucky doesn't even have a carjacking statute. The most you could get someone on would be first-degree robbery, which is 50% of that time. And please, I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman, if I've gotten any of those facts about your state wrong.
Oh, that's right. We don't have carjacking.
Really? Because I just found a case in March from your state in the neighborhood of St. Denis in Louisville, where there was a serious carjacking.
Lou City.
Oh, actually, that was May. That was this month, May 7th.
If there's a carjacking in Kentucky, it'll be in Louisville, I can assure you.
There's no carjackings outside of Louisville in your state?
I'm sure in the course of history there's been some, but you have one a day in Washington, D.C., sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And with armed robbery, the burglar's there's a lot higher chance if a burglar's gonna try to rob someone in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, that they're gonna.
So is that an argument to lower the penalties?
Because
That's why there are lower
Kentucky
penalties?
merchants, many Kentucky homeowners practice their right to bear arms, and that's a disincentive for burglars to commit armed robbery in Kentucky versus cities where they have excessive limits on guns. So the gun issue goes both ways. It can also be a detriment to crime.
But in any event, my point, Mr. McGovern, was simply that the people in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, not part of my jurisdiction, but it is under the jurisdiction of the Oversight Committee, the people in Washington, D.C. are taking their crime problem seriously, as I'm sure the people of Louisville are and the rest of Kentucky are. And there's crime all across the country. And apparently what they've been doing in Washington, D.C. has been working, as they've had fairly dramatic reductions in violent crime and in homicide. Will you just explain why this markup was delayed to 8 p.m., throwing everybody's schedule into chaos today and the buildings closed to the public? Why was that done?
Okay, that's not an appropriate inquiry.
The time of the meeting is not an appropriate procedural
No,
inquiry?
your inquiry is not an appropriate parliamentary inquiry. So let's get back to order.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this special nighttime episode, we resume the madcap comedy mystery series called Comer's High Crimes and Misadventures, the hilarious quest to impeach a president who has done nothing wrong, an avowedly low-budget but multi-million-dollar taxpayer-funded production which most Americans assumed had ended 2 months ago and had completely forgotten about. But tonight, with the cast and crew now fresh back from a surprise
You mean
trip
like
to
the
New York
January
City,
6th committee?
Stop it.
I'd like my time restored to me, Mr. Chairman.
Order, order. Chair recognizes ranking member.
Their fierce devotion to this clearly reformed, devout, and pious Florida spiritual leader who many supporters are now calling the Messiah from Mar-a-Lago. Of course, in the meantime, Chairman Jordan in the House Judiciary
Will
Committee
the gentleman yield?
preempted. No, I'm in the middle
Sir,
of my
I appreciate
introduction.
that photo. It's a good photo.
Yeah.
I would like a copy of that. Done with it.
Would you like a signed one, Raskin?
Yes,
Could
I
you
wanna-
get your members in order, Mr. Chairman?
It's a great
Order,
photo. I want a copy
order,
of it.
order.
Real obstruction was Trump and his administration refusing to provide information Congress requested in more than 100 different congressional investigations and inquiries. And I know that pleases the gentlelady from Georgia because he issued.
I just want to hear Joe Biden. Why can't the American people hear him?
Order, Mr. Chairman. Get her under control.
There's no basis for this outlandish contempt proceeding, which only further disgraces our committee along with judiciary. Accordingly, Mr. Chairman, and since your members seem to be in such a hurry to be done with this, I move to immediately adjourn these proceedings.
Seconded.
So in your opening statement, you moved to adjourn.
I'm moving to adjourn these proceedings.
Second.
Motion and second. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
No.
The noes have it. Motion fails. Now, do any other members wish to be heard?
Recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested.
Mr. Chairman,
I vote yes. And how did Mr. Jordan vote? I mean, I vote no. I'm sorry, I vote no.
the chairman votes no.
Yeah.
The nays are 24, the ayes are 19.
The noes have it. The motion to adjourn fails. Is any
Mr. Chairman, move to
other
strike the
members
last
seek
word.
recognition?
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, so welcome to Oversight After Dark. If you love James Comer at 11 o'clock in the morning, you're really going to love him at 8:30 p.m. So, members, the hearing was moved today. We don't have to ask the question. The hearing was moved today so that members could go to New York and attend the Trump hearing. But how's he doing? He's complained that he's chilly in the courtroom. Is it chilly? Is it chilly?
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I'll assume it's
He's
chilly.
doing very good.
Okay, good.
President Biden and his administration have refused to take any responsibility for the catastrophe they created. And now the Biden administration is doing what it does best, asking taxpayers for more money. But more money isn't going to solve much on the border, because what we are seeing isn't a money problem. It's a policy problem. It's a problem of not enforcing U.S. immigration law. No amount of money can fix bad policy. Our solutions are simple. Illegal activity on the border must be met with adequate and timely consequences, not a quick release to await years-long removal proceedings where hundreds of thousands of aliens file frivolous or fraudulent applications that create delays for those who truly qualify.
It's become obvious that Trump's party doesn't want immigration solutions at the border. They want immigration problems to run against. The other main issue they used to demagogue, abortion, is no longer available to them because the country's negative response to the Supreme Court's destruction of Roe versus Wade in 2022 demonstrates this is still a country that prizes freedom. rejects theocratic repression, and opposes the MAGA Republicans' eagerness to pass a national law banning abortion rights. So they can't talk about those plans anymore. The cat's got their tongue.
We, as members of the House of Representatives, have a duty to ensure congressional subpoenas are fully complied with by those who receive them, people, companies, and particularly the federal government. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle constantly talk about the threats to our institutions, but then they turn around and defend the DOJ's noncompliance with a duly authorized subpoena showing their partisanship. If my colleagues will not defend the institution of Congress, the institution they are a part of, how can we listen with a straight face when they talk about the sanctity of our other institutions?
Even after weaponizing House committees for this nakedly political pursuit, after amassing nearly 4 million pages of documents and 80 hours of testimony from 19 different witnesses, and even with their robotic diligence in cherry-picking facts, distorting evidence, wasting taxpayer money, and echoing blatant Russian disinformation, Republicans still haven't found any evidence that President Biden committed a crime, much less an impeachable offense. Not a single morsel of evidence. The cupboard is empty. Last week, Republicans surrendered what was left of their floundering investigation, making half-hearted, last-ditch criminal referrals of the president's family members to the DOJ for some weak-tea gotcha accusations. Most importantly, these referrals did not identify any crime, any misdemeanor, or any impeachable offense that President Biden even allegedly committed. Not one. Now, in the wake of the collapse of this effort, they want America to believe that their 17-month impeachment quest failed, not because they had no relevant evidence of any identifiable impeachable offense, but because Attorney General Garland did not produce an audio tape of a book whose words they already possess and all of America can read. The Attorney General has given Chairman Comer all the information he has sought, and our do-nothing Congress is now finally about to do something, but it's something ridiculous and absurd.
President Biden's Department of Justice appears to be taking every step to insulate him from the consequences, whether it's hiding these audio recordings or attempting to give Hunter Biden a sweetheart plea deal to shield Joe Biden from facing accountability for his role in his family's influence peddling schemes. This is unacceptable. The House of Representatives cannot serve as a necessary check on the presidency if the executive branch is free to ignore the House's subpoenas.
Our colleagues invite us today to become the first Congress in the history of the United States to hold someone in contempt for complying with our demands. And their target is the Attorney General of the United States. Remember, they promised to reveal the greatest presidential high crime and misdemeanor in American history, an act of treachery and deceit that dwarfs even the incitement of a violent mob insurrection and an attempted political coup that took place right here against our Constitution, our Congress, our Vice President, in this chamber. But after their truly prodigious investigation, punctuated, admittedly, by some unfortunate mishaps like Chinese spies, fake evidence, pornographic displays in committee, and their own witnesses testifying that there were no grounds for presidential impeachment, they have nothing to show for their arduous work other than one more debunked Russian disinformation operation and one more indicted GOP informant and star witness. Rather than admit defeat in this bumbling operation and look for some other way to actually aid the public good, they've decided to flail about in mock outrage against a series of phantom tyrants in the hopes of distracting everyone from this epic flop. A number of our colleagues wanted to lecture you, Administrator Regan, about the role of agencies, which are, of course, indispensable in implementing the will of Congress. That's why Congress set up the EPA. That's why Congress set up the National Labor Relations Board. That's why Congress set up the Department of Justice. And our colleagues have no problem using those agencies to get the things done they want to do. If you read their Project 2025, they want the President of the United States to be able to use the Department of Justice for the first time in American history to go after his political opponents. And to Oh, well, if you disagree with that, then I'm delighted to hear it, Mr. Chairman.
Which Department of Justice going after political opponents? The Merrick Garland Department of Justice or the
Well, let's
next
see.
Department?
There's a case right now against the Democratic senator from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez. There's a case right now against a Democratic congressman from Texas.
I see
our
a
colleague,
pattern
Mr.
with
Cuellar.
Democrats.
And well, wait a second. No, don't be too clever. You're a smart man, but try to follow a principled argument. You just claimed that the Department of Justice was somehow biased against Republicans, and I'm naming you cases where the DOJ is going after Democrats. Your problem is the jury system in New York, which found unanimously that Donald Trump was guilty of 34 criminal felonies. That's got nothing to do with the Department of Justice.
Well, when the Department of Justice sends the number 3 guy down there to prosecute the case on behalf of
Which case are you referring to?
the Trump case that you just referred to.
You're talking about the District Attorney Bragg's case in New York?
The number 3 guy went down to
Okay.
New York.
All right, well, we'll have to take that up at another point, but I'm talking to you about what former President Trump says he wants to do. And if you think it's outrageous, then I am delighted to hear it, that he would use the Department of
No,
Justice.
I just thought it was outrageous you saying the Department of Justice under Trump was going to be weaponized when we believe that this Department of Justice has been pretty darn weaponized.
Well, what is the proof of that? I just named you 3 cases where the Department of Justice is going after Democrats. And I mean, that's a very serious slur against the Department of Justice and the Attorney General.
I stand by that.
You stand by your slur then. Well, I would love us to have a complete hearing then on whether or not it's true, because I think it's wrong. And in fact, really, it's just setting the stage for Donald Trump to try to use the Department of Justice as an instrument of persecution against his political opponents, real or imagined.
Well, we don't know if Donald Trump's going to be president or not. Are you throwing in the towel, Mr. Raskin?
No. I certainly hope he doesn't try to steal the election the way he did last time. And I hope we'll
So
be
you're an
prepared this
election
time.
denier, Mr. Raskin.
Oh, no. I don't deny it. I affirm that Joe Biden beat him by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. We know that happened. And yet, I hope you're not an insurrection denier, because you were there with me that day when they came in chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Do you remember that?
I remember January the 6th.
You remember them chanting, "Hang Mike Pence"? Them trying to
certify.
overthrow the election?
Unlike you, I have never not voted to certify an election.
I'm sorry?
Didn't you vote to not certify the 2016 election?
The 2016 election, I simply spoke against irregularities. I didn't try to overthrow the government of the United States. I didn't try to get the vice president not to do his job, and I didn't even go to a senator. But in
I've
any
always
event-
voted to certify elections. I just want to state that for the record.
So then you would agree then that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election?
I
Did you say
voted.
that?
I voted to certify the election. I've said that a million times. When the 50
Did
states.
you say once that Donald Trump lost the election?
I have said that. When the 50 states certified the election was over. Now we've gone over. Do you want to conclude? Let's get off of this. Good EPA.
I will.
here.
No, I don't mind the diversion, Mr. Chairman.
If you look at what Mr. Burleson and I mentioned with respect to wastewater with meat processing plants, our processors and our farmers tell us this is going to have a significant impact on the cost of food. And we're talking about chicken McNuggets at McDonald's. We're talking about chicken at Chick-fil-A and things like that. The average working class Americans go through the drive-through after work and
Mr.
order.
Chairman, forgive me. Do you know what the cost of 10-piece chicken McNuggets is today?
Well, I buy a lot of chicken nugget meals.
It's under $5. It's $4.49 at the closest one you can get here. They're just, I mean, and Impossible Nuggets are even less.
So there's no inflation at McDonald's, Mr. Raskin. I would say I spend more money at McDonald's than any person in Congress, and I'll stand by that. I'll testify under oath.
Well,
my 3 kids.
We certainly don't mean to bankrupt you with our environmental regulations when you go to McDonald's. After 11 months of this, no one can tell us what President Biden's crime was, much less where it happened, when it happened, what the motive was, who the perpetrators were, or who the victims were. Maybe the funniest thing I've ever seen in Congress was yesterday in the Rules Committee when Congressman Neguse kept asking Congressman Reschenthaler what the crime was.
What is the specific constitutional crime that you're investigating?
Well, we're having an inquiry, so we can do an investigation and control the production of witnesses.
And what is the crime you're investigating?
And documents. high crimes, misdemeanors, and bribery.
What
It's in
high
the
crime and
Constitution.
misdemeanor are you investigating?
Look, I will, once I get time, I will explain what we're looking at, and I will make the equivalency
No, I'm just
of
asking you
the
for
last
the-
impeachment.
Now, Nugus, of course, was involved in a real impeachment investigation of a real presidential offense, the incitement of a violent political insurrection against this Congress, against the Vice President of the United States, against the Constitution, and against the election of 2020. We did not need Sherlock Holmes and a magnifying glass to find the presidential crime with Donald Trump. It came right into this House and smashed us in the face. Mr. Speaker, I played a game with the little kids in our family at Thanksgiving. I asked them whether they'd seen my hen weigh. And when they said, "What's a hen weigh?" I said 4 or 5 pounds. It's a dad joke, and some of the bigger kids got it. But when I asked the little kids, like 3 or 4, if they'd seen my hen weigh, they said, "What's a hen weigh?" And I said 3 or 4 pounds, and they started looking for it. And when the other kids came along and asked what they were doing, they said, "We're looking for Uncle Jamie's hen weigh." And then for hours, they were looking everywhere for my hen weigh, under the sofa and under the chairs, and it could go on for days like that. Mr. Speaker, we're all looking for the Republican Party's hen weigh. It just weighs 3 or 4 pounds, but it's costing us tens of millions of dollars. So please forgive me for spoiling the party here, but I want to say this to America. There is no hen weigh. And this stupid, blundering investigation is keeping us from getting any real work done for the people of America. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The White House has shown it is willing to alter transcripts to protect Joe Biden's image. It is insufficient to simply take the Justice Department at its word that the transcripts have not been altered. The Department of Justice does not get to decide how to comply with the subpoena, just as the people who receive subpoenas from DOJ cannot determine how they will comply. The Oversight Committee has conducted its own investigation into President Biden's mishandling of classified materials, and its findings contradict key portions of the White House's and President Biden's personal attorney's official narrative. Months of investigating by the Oversight Committee have revealed the White House has attempted to withhold the truth from the American people. If the Attorney General chooses to defy Congress and not produce the audio recordings, he must face the consequences of his actions. The path before us is clear, and the Oversight Committee recommends the Attorney General be found in contempt of Congress. Neither he nor President Biden are above Congress's oversight.
There's plainly no basis for holding the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, in contempt, unless we're going to start holding people in contempt for complying with the committee's demands. This is actually the third witness who has faithfully cooperated with the Oversight Committee that the chairman has now threatened with contempt, the first being FBI Director Christopher Wray, the second being Hunter Biden. So this is the third time, and again, it makes no sense. Attorney General Garland and the Biden administration have consistently cooperated with the demands made by Chairman Comer and Jordan for information relating to Special Counsel Hur's review of President Biden. The Attorney General released the Special Counsel's report on President Biden in full. The DOJ made Special Counsel Hur available for multiple hours of testimony and examination before the Judiciary Committee, and he answered all of our questions. The DOJ also provided correspondence between the Department of Justice and the President's lawyers, documents referenced in the Hur report's appendix, and the transcript of the Special Counsel's interview with the President's ghostwriter, Mark Zwanitzer, in complete detail in response to the chair's requests. And the Attorney General provided us the full transcript of President Biden's voluntary 5-hour interview with the Special Counsel, all 250-plus pages of it. The Department of Justice and the administration have given us all the information we asked for. Now, Chairman Comer and Chairman Jordan, who was subpoenaed by the January 6th Select Committee and never rendered a single document to it or spent 1 minute testifying before it, respond by seeking to hold the Attorney General of the United States of America in contempt based on preposterous claims of obstruction. Like their slapstick impeachment drives against President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas, this new tragic comic contempt drive is doomed because it's wrong on the facts, it's wrong on the law, and it's wrong about who the real culprit is. The motion before you today projects the lawless conduct that Republicans regularly defended when Donald Trump was president onto an attorney general who has devoted his entire career and life to defending the rule of law. Unlike the Biden administration, which has cooperated fully here, the Trump administration refused to comply in any way with the 2019 impeachment inquiry into Trump's shakedown of Ukrainian President Zelensky. Trump ordered administration officials who were material witnesses not to cooperate with requests for interviews. In total, 12 federal officials absolutely refused to testify before Congress, 10 of whom blatantly defied congressional subpoenas. And this was just a part of a larger pattern of obstruction in the Trump administration, which refused to cooperate with more than 100 committee investigations and inquiries on a range of subjects, something that did not seem to trouble my colleagues at all. By contrast, Attorney General Garland and the Department of Justice have cooperated substantially, materially, and fully with every single one of the requests, bombarding his office in this bad faith, madcap, endless impeachment investigation. In fact, every member of Congress, and indeed every American, can today go online and read President Biden's answers to every single question posed to him by Special Counsel Robert Hur. And we can access it because under Attorney General Garland, the DOJ provided the full and complete, I repeat, full and complete transcript of the presidential interview to Chairman James Comer and Jim Jordan. Meantime, the good chairman of the Oversight Committee has not released the transcripts of any of the committee's interviews regarding the classified document. None at all. But Republicans have responded to Garland's striking good faith cooperation by trying to hold the Attorney General in contempt because they say they do not want to read the president's answers in the interview. They want to listen to the book on tape. In a last-ditch attempt to blame a cabinet member for the spectacular failure of their laughingstock impeachment drive, they have contrived an allegation that Garland has impeded their inquiry by preventing them from hearing rather than reading President Biden's interview with the special counsel. The claim falsely implies that reading the words written out across 250 transcript pages isn't enough, and that hearing them would somehow change the content of the president's interview or the meaning of his answers and suddenly reveal the holy grail of the 118th Congress, evidence of the still unnamed and unidentified impeachable offense they've been spending millions of taxpayer dollars looking for. In fact, they want to pour over 5 hours of President Biden's taped interview to search not for an impeachable offense, because they know that doesn't exist at this point, but for a verbal mistake, like a mispronounced name that they can turn into a political TV attack ad in the presidential campaign. They're about to hold the Attorney General of the United States of America in contempt for actually complying with the demands of Congress. I urge the committee to reject this request for a rule to bring a contempt resolution against the Attorney General of the United States to the floor of the House of Representatives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Schneider, what role does political and financial corruption play in the authoritarian regimes like China and Russia?
It always plays a very fundamental role, as we discussed before, in recruitment, but it also plays an ideological role. Since the basic argument is that democracies are just hypocrisy, everyone is basically corrupt, only money matters. Corruption is used not just as a way to bring in individuals, but it's also used as a way to discredit the entire system.
And internally, those regimes are based on corruption.
And so the point externally is to normalize that. Back in the 20th century, we had rivals that had other visions of the future. Now we don't. Now we have rivals, and this pertains both to China and Russia, whose main message is that our system isn't what it seems to be. There are really no alternatives to just autocratic regimes where only money and power count.
One of our colleagues chided our side of the aisle for raising Donald Trump's name. I think that was presumably directed at Representative Norton, who discussed the millions of dollars that Donald Trump pocketed in unlawful foreign government emoluments from the Chinese government and from the state-owned ICBC Bank while he was president. Is corruption in America irrelevant to our ability to withstand foreign propaganda by authoritarian regimes like China and Russia?
Of course it's not irrelevant. It's very relevant. The way that any kind of political warfare proceeds is by these sorts of connections. A message becomes more plausible because a person is a bit more corrupt. A person is a bit more corrupt. A message becomes a bit more plausible. Anyone who is serious about political warfare would be very attentive to these underlying financial issues, of course.
One of our colleagues mentioned an effort that is underway to stop U.S. government agencies from blowing the whistle on Chinese and Russian propaganda on social media. There are some people who say that it violates the First Amendment if our agencies say there's Chinese propaganda on your website, there's Russian propaganda on your website. What do you think about that? Do you think that in a free society, the government should be able at least to alert the social media or private internet service providers about the existence of foreign government propaganda on their vehicles?
Colleagues in different ways have already raised the point that that TikTok is not the only problem. The problem is the way that social media is designed as such. Democracies tend to work better when institutions are set up in such a way that factuality has an advantage over propaganda. Unfortunately, social media is set up in a different way. It gives an advantage, a financial advantage for advertisers to attention-seeking and therefore to shocking propaganda. We know that this can be mediated because when attempts have been made, either by corporations themselves in cooperation or by the government, we have been able to dramatically reduce hostile state-sponsored propaganda. What we face now in 2024 is a major corporation, Twitter, which has chosen not to police itself even as much as the other platforms do. And therefore, we face a situation in which states are taking advantage of this sort of chaos. Hostile actors take advantage of this chaos to change the information environment. This is par excellence an example of psychological warfare, and it would be foolish if the United States government did not allow itself to draw attention to it.
I wonder if you can help us figure out where we've come as a committee, Professor Snyder. About a year ago, our GOP colleagues began heralding an FBI form, FD 1023, that recorded allegations that President Biden acted corruptly in Ukraine and tried to promote these as credible allegations. It turned out that these were lies, and the person who was promoting them has been indicted for lying to the FBI and constructing a false record. It turns out that he was up to his neck in connections to Russian foreign agents, and yet our colleagues at various points called this a smoking gun, said it showed proof that the Bidens took bribes, and so on. Chairman Jason Smith, for example, said this was a smoking gun, and it was the definitive proof that the Bidens took bribes. It's obviously been dropped, and yet this was the genesis of our investigation. How do we understand?
That's just simply not true, but go ahead.
I'll yield to the chairman if you want to take some more time.
No.
Well, you can use your time.
Are you saying the bank statements are Russian disinformation, that the Bidens took $9,000 from
China?
I
agree you've been talking about
Tony
bank
Bobulinski
statements for
said
more
it
than a
was
year, but they don't show anything other than there was no crime.
So it's
what do your bank
okay,
statements show?
for, as Tony Bobulinski said, for China to bribe Joe Biden's family with $9 million.
But that's the lie that's been discredited. I mean, where is your impeachment investigation? If Joe Biden took a $9 million bribe from China, why aren't you impeaching him for that?
Well, who says we're not?
Well, I can invite Mr. Moskowitz to come back in. Do you want to move for impeachment today? Because I thought that was your main agenda item. You said it was the paramount priority of the committee.
No, this is a hearing on China, and you all have an obsession with Russia and Trump. It's disturbing.
We can talk about China and Trump or Russia and Trump.
You need therapy, Mr. Raskin.
No. You need therapy. You're the one who's involved with the deranged politician, not me, okay? I've divorced myself from Donald Trump a long time ago. You're the one who needs to disentangle from that situation. And I will tell you this. If you believe that it would have been illegal for Joe Biden to take $5 million from Ukraine, it certainly would have been. What do you think about Donald Trump taking more than $5 million from the Chinese government while he was president?
Well, we know that Donald Trump had a legitimate business that he talked about and he campaigned on.
The legitimate business was the White House. He sold the White House.
Oh, give me a break.
He was president.
What business were the Bidens in?
What business did Joe Biden's family own? What business were they in? Did they have hotels? Did they have a social media company? Did they have golf courses? Did they have casinos? Did they have office buildings?
Mr. Chairman.
What business? Did they have an energy
Mr.
company?
Chairman, we have spent tens of millions of dollars pursuing Joe
that is
Biden,
not
and you have not
true.
identified
That
a
is a
single
lie.
crime. I would
Order.
like my time restored.
Well, no, your time was
I would
expired.
like
I've
no,
given
you
3
interrupted
extra
me.
minutes.
I want my
No,
time
you
restored.
had your time. You went above, and I'll let Ms. Thornton go a minute.
You know what?
Here, sit down, everybody. Come back. This is about China. We asked a simple question. No, Ms. Presley, you're out of order. Sit down.
Mr. Chairman,
You're out of order.
Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
can I make a motion that we take a break for 5 minutes?
We're going to keep going. We'll let the record show that Mr. Raskins could not answer the question. What
First of
did
all,
the Bidens do to receive the money?
Let me start with this. My last name is Raskin, okay? We've sat next to each other for more than a year. You don't have to add the S. Number 2, I would like my time restored. And number 3,
No, you have
have
your
not
time. You're
identified
out
a
of
single
order.
crime.
No.
Well, what is the crime that you want to impeach Joe Biden for and keep this nonsense going?
Well,
Why? What is the crime? Tell America right now. You can have the rest of
you're
my
about
time.
to find out.
What
very
is the
soon.
crime?
You're about to find out
Name
very
it.
soon. Chair
We
now
inhabit
recognizes
a
Mr.
propaganda
Biggs from
experiment.
Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This is not a complicated matter. The Oversight and Judiciary Committees issued duly authorized legal subpoenas to Attorney General Garland for a certain set of documents, including the audio recordings of Special Counsel Hur's interview with President Biden. The Attorney General has refused to produce these audio recordings. Unlike what my Democratic colleagues keep claiming, this is not just Republicans who need these recordings for their oversight duties. Media outlets, including the AP, CBS, CNN, NBC, and the Washington Post, among others, have filed suit to get these same audio recordings as well. Because the media, like everyone else, knows there's no substitute for a recording of an interview. Not a transcript, not a summary, not the Attorney General's judgment that Congress doesn't need it.
Attorney General Garland gave us the special counsel's report on President Biden in full. He made the special counsel available to us in committee for hours of testimony where he answered all our questions, and he provided the full transcript of the president's voluntary 5-hour interview with the special counsel, all 250 pages of it. The whole world can read President Biden's interview and his answers unedited. But that's apparently not enough. Now they want to hold the Attorney General in contempt for not turning over the audio tape of the interview that we have the verbatim transcript of. And why is that important? Well, in case you've lost the thread of this madcap wild goose chase, America, remember this is an impeachment investigation. Do they think that the holy grail of the 118th Congress, evidence of a presidential high crime and misdemeanor, is lurking in the pauses or the background throat clearings and sneezes on the audio tape? Well, of course not. They know there's no high crime or misdemeanor to be found because they've spent the last 17 months and millions of our taxpayer dollars looking for it, and it simply does not exist. They literally don't even know what they're looking for anymore. So why do they want it? Well, they're hoping that in the 5 hours of President Biden's testimony, they can find a mispronounced word or phrase or a brief stammer, which they can then turn into an embarrassing political TV attack ad. Get it, America? That's what this is all about. And holding the Attorney General of the United States in contempt is one more useful distraction from the complete and devastating implosion of the Biden impeachment probe, which of course was the #1 priority of these talented leaders. Their first distraction was to impeach Secretary Ali Mayorkas as a paltry consolation prize, but that pathetic decoy action blew up in their hands. Then the plan was to skip the mundane work of casting votes and actually doing committee business to travel on a collective spiritual pilgrimage on Amtrak to New York City to attend the criminal trial of an unmentionable American felon, one of 19 million in the country. But that strange journey to Mecca also blew up in their faces when this mystery political false prophet was convicted unanimously by a jury of his peers on dozens of felony criminal counts in a fair American trial. They tried to salvage the credibility of this bizarre expedition by blaming the American justice system for being weaponized against Republicans. But this political extremism quickly melted away when the son of President Biden, the original target of their wrath, was also prosecuted and convicted, like another disarmed felon whose name may now not be spoken on the floor, apparently, by a unanimous jury of his peers on all counts against him. And that trial, unlike the trial whose very existence must be sent down the Orwellian memory hole to save someone hurt feelings, was actually tried in the federal system. So what's left to do now? Well, let's hold the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, in contempt, of course. This will be sure to placate an unrepentant and anonymous convicted felon from New York and distract everybody else for a day or two. I confess it's a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to be asked to hold the Attorney General of the United States in contempt of Congress for overwhelmingly complying with the committee's demands by members who voted against contempt citations for Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro, two persons subpoenaed by the January 6th Select Committee who never spent a single minute. Could I have one more?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I grant the gentleman an additional minute.
Bannon and Navarro never spent a minute with the January 6th committee, never turned over a single document to our committee. These people had 0% compliance with Congress. They demonstrated true contempt, which is why they've been sentenced to jail. But Chairman Comer, in his wisdom, would hold the Attorney General of the United States of America in contempt for what I think is 100% compliance, but in any event is something like 98 or 99% compliance. If you think a federal official is not rendered proper compliance, you take them to court, you don't hold them in contempt, and it's rich beyond measure, like a billionaire rich, to be asked to hold the Attorney General in contempt by people who themselves received subpoenas to testify before the January 6th committee, who never rendered a single document nor a single minute of testimony to the January 6th committee. I urge Congress to reject this absurd motion, and I'm happy to yield back to the chairman.
Mr. Speaker, this contempt resolution is the latest attempt to tear down our democracy. The Department of Justice has cooperated with congressional Republicans at every turn. But after 92,000 pages of documents, more than a dozen transcribed interviews, and a 250-page transcript that was verified, my colleagues still aren't satisfied. They are doing this in service of one man, the disgraced former president, in a misguided attempt to distract from his crimes. On May 30th, a jury of stranger citizens found Mr. Trump guilty of 34 felony charges. It is beyond disheartening that a former president and now potential presidential candidate again was convicted of coordinating a, quote, unlawful conspiracy to win in the 2016 election and falsifying records to cover his tryst with an adult porn star. I'm grateful that the rule of law prevailed, yet I am deeply concerned that our democratic institutions are under threat. Some of these attacks coming from within. Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan said a kangaroo court convicted President Trump. Speaker Johnson called the trial a purely political exercise. Mr. Trump apparently pities himself as a so-called political prisoner. All this to tear down our Americans' faith in the rule of law. Contrary to his complaints, Mr. Trump was tried and treated fairly. Justice was served in a courtroom that was open and filled with reporters, and a jury that was chosen by the prosecution and the defense. This is the rule of law at work. Political rhetoric and deliberate misinformation, the likes of these and dangerous many others, erode faith in our institutions and threaten the safety of the American people. These attacks undermine the rule of law, which stands to protect the rights of all people. When Attorney General Merrick Garland was before the Judiciary Committee,
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. When Attorney General was before the Judiciary Committee, he described his career upholding the rule of law. In his own words, that meant ensuring that, quote, we treat like cases alike, that we do not have enemies or friends, that we do not pay attention to the political parties or the wealth or the power or the influence of the people we are investigating, that we follow the facts and the law. This is what distinguishes America from our adversaries. I yield back.
The D.C. Crimes Act overturns targeted portions of the D.C. Council's Youth Rehabilitation Act by amending the definition of a youth offender from a person under the age of 25 to under the age of 18. Let me emphasize D.C.'s current law. Currently, D.C. Code allows a criminal under the age of 25 to be given the same leniency that is afforded to minors. This bill requires that we treat adult criminals as adults. To further address soaring juvenile crime in the district, the bill would require the D.C. Attorney General to create a publicly available website that tracks juvenile crime data. This data will inform Congress, the district's elected officials, the Metropolitan Police Department, the public, and others on the severity of juvenile crime in the city. Finally, the bill prohibits the D.C. Council from amending its sentencing and criminal liability laws, locking in place current D.C. criminal law, and leaving Congress as the sole authority to amend such laws in the future.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. McGovern. The D.C. Crimes Act is the fourth bill the majority has brought to the floor in this Congress to try to overturn laws enacted by the Council of the District of Columbia. It's called the D.C. Criminal Reforms to Immediately Make Everyone Safe Act of 2024, which would be quite a magic trick. This act is even more radical than the other bills that they've brought forward overturning the legitimately passed laws of Washington, D.C. This one doesn't simply overturn current D.C. law, but it permanently strips Washington, D.C. of its authority over criminal laws generally. This legislation represents the largest rollback of D.C.'s legislative authority to govern itself in nearly 30 years. At a time when the 700,000 tax-paying, draftable citizens of Washington, D.C. are seeking political equality with all other American citizens through the statehood process, this legislation is a serious insult and affront to the people of Washington. Now, it's part of a general effort to attack and undermine and vilify Washington, D.C. Ex-President Trump has repeatedly called for the federal government to take over the District of Columbia. Legislation has been introduced to abolish the D.C. government, and the D.C. Crimes Act is part of this campaign to demonize Washington, D.C., its locally elected leadership, and its local laws. Now, my colleagues think that the D.C. Crimes Act shows that they're tough on crime. Far from it, they don't seem to realize that the bill prevents the elected council of the District of Columbia from ever increasing any criminal penalty, including for murder, carjacking, rape, child abuse, you name it. The bill amends the D.C. Home Rule Act to say that the District of Columbia Council may not, quote, enact any act, resolution, or rule to change any criminal liability sentence in effect on the date of the enactment of the D.C. Crimes Act of 2024. The bill does not define the term criminal liability sentence, which is not a term of art either in federal criminal law or District of Columbia law. But despite the inartful drafting, the language is clearly intended to prohibit the D.C. Council from ever changing any statutory criminal penalties. It therefore likely prohibits the D.C. Council from creating any new criminal laws altogether. So I don't know whether or not this was a mistake or this was intended, but it clearly prohibits the D.C. Council from increasing any criminal penalties, which is what the District Council did recently in legislation that was passed by the Council of the District of Columbia. It increased several criminal penalties. That would be now outside of its legislative authority under this act. And it appears to me that it prohibits the D.C. Council from creating any new criminal laws altogether. So perhaps it's just a messaging bill, and it's just meant to send some kind of ambiguous signal to the people of Washington, D.C., but I don't think it accomplishes what the authors intended to accomplish. And as I said, I think it's an insult to the city where the nation's capital is located. And I will say the chairman mentioned the specific purpose of reversing provisions related to the DC's Youth Rehabilitation Amendment Act of 1985, which allows the courts in D.C. to use sentencing alternatives for a person who's 24 years old or younger. Some states have similar legislation that set it at 18 or 21. My state is one that sets it at a lower place. South Carolina is one of the states that mirrors D.C. in giving courts the power to consider youthful offenders at age 24 for differential treatment under their laws. And in South Carolina, someone who is treated that way at 24 or 23 or 22 may be sentenced to no more than 6 years in prison. In D.C., they can be treated as a youth at 24 or 23 or 22, and they could have an open-ended prison term of 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. And I'm just giving that as one example of a state that has a more permissive and open-ended system than the District of Columbia does. So it's not clear to me exactly why the target here is put on Washington, D.C. In any event, the legislation is written in such a way as to prevent D.C. from increasing statutory penalties or developing new statutory offenses, and this is the kind of ham-handed result we get when we try to pass a messaging bill just to vilify and disparage the people of the nation's capital. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back to you.
Who's the author of this bill?
This is Byron Donald's
All
bill.
right. Where's he from? He's from Florida? Mr. Raskin, are you aware that in Florida, adults can be treated as juveniles up to 24?
I believe that's the same rule that D.C. has, and
Right, yeah.
both of those are more liberal rules than we have in Maryland, but we want to leave it up, I think, to each state and local government to decide for itself.
I guess the question is, why does the author of this bill think it's inappropriate for D.C., but it's okay for his home state of Florida?
Well, but I wish my friend Mr. Roy were still here, because I really wanted to respond to some of the things that he said that go right to your point. But I do believe that there's an effort here to scapegoat Washington, D.C. I mean, my friend from Texas seems to be completely unaware of everything that Mayor Bowser in Washington and Chairman Mendelson, the chairman of the council, and the 13-member city council have been doing to fight crime in the city, which is part, of course, of a nationwide wave. And in fact, they've had real practical effect, positive effect. Total crime in D.C. This year is already down 16%. Violent crime is down 25%, and homicide is down 20%. So several months ago, they passed something called the Secure D.C. Act, which would be illegitimate under the legislation that our friends on the GOP side have brought forth today. They increased the criminal penalty for possession of a sawed-off shotgun or a ghost gun. And I know some of them don't like legislation relating to ghost guns, but in D.C., they brought a criminal penalty for it. They increased penalty for possession of a machine gun. Again, I know some people don't like that, but the people in D.C. decided to do it. They increased penalty for repeat sexual abuse. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed in the parks of D.C. and in recreational property. They increased and enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against vulnerable adults, people with a mental disability or older people. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against rideshare drivers, transit operators, metro rail station managers, and employees and passengers. There's been an epidemic of crime against people who drive buses. and metros across the country, and they took action against it. They also created a whole bunch of new offenses for possession of a firearm with intent to sell. Again, I know some of my friends who fashion themselves Second Amendment champions don't like any legislation like they passed in D.C. that criminalizes the selling of firearms. They created a new offense for strangulation. They created a new offense for directing organized retail theft. They created a new offense for possessing a firearm with a removed or altered serial number. They created a new offense for firing bullets in public. They created a new offense for the unlawful discarding of a firearm or ammunition outside of the law. Again, that may or may not be right for Maryland or Kentucky or Minnesota, but that's what they chose in D.C., and they're taking action. And I just think it's an insult and an affront to fellow Americans, albeit unrepresented by voting members in the House and the Senate, to just blindly overturn all of their laws, accuse them of doing nothing, accuse them of not caring about the public safety and public welfare in their own jurisdiction, and then make it impossible for them to create any new offenses. And I'm starting to think maybe it's because so many of their offenses have to do with the problem of gun violence, and maybe that's why they want to essentially legislatively disarm the people in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Raskin, let me get this straight now. So our Republican colleagues portray this bill that is before us as tough on crime. Let me ask you a couple of, I'll make this quick, so yes or no questions. Would this bill that we're dealing with right now, what they call the D.C. Crimes Act, would it permanently prohibit the D.C. Council from increasing the penalties for murder, child sexual abuse, rape, carjacking, and every other crime?
Yes, and my friends have not denied it.
Okay. It strikes me that this bill not only prohibits the D.C. Council from increasing or decreasing criminal penalties, but could be construed to prohibit the D.C. Council from establishing any new crimes at all, since D.C. could not, quote, change any criminal liability sentence. Creating a new criminal penalty could be construed as a change. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree, and you could only create a new crime if it did not have a sentence attached to it.
So you mentioned in March the D.C. Council passed the Secure D.C. Omnibus Amendment Act, which increased penalties for, among other things, gun crimes, such as possession of a machine gun and child sexual abuse. It also created new crimes such as strangulation and firing bullets in public. Is it true that this bill, that we're talking about here today, would have prevented the D.C. Council from passing the Secure D.C. Omnibus Amendment Act?
Yes, and it seems like several of their new statutory offenses related to gun crimes and crimes related to gun violence, and that might be part of the motivation in trying to wipe out their legislative authority.
And as you know, this Congress, I think by any measure, is dysfunctional and can only seem to get around to bringing over the finish line must-pass bills. So under this bill, would Congress be the only entity that could increase or decrease statutory penalties in D.C.?
Yes.
Now, former President Trump has repeatedly called for the federal government to take over D.C., and I think my Republican friends like this power game that they play. I mean, they could actually give D.C. more representation in Congress with enhanced voting rights for our delegate, give her the same rights as we all have, and maybe even talk about 2 U.S. senators. But he has talked about taking over the D.C. government. Legislation has been introduced to repeal D.C. Home Rule Act. Home rule has been under greater threat in this Congress than in a generation. Should D.C. residents be worried that a Republican Congress, and God forbid, a Republican president, should they be worried that they could abolish the D.C. government entirely?
Well, that should be among their worries, given the hypothetical you've just offered, yes.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, I mean, Mr. Raskin, when he began, he talked about how the crime rate in D.C. has gone down. Just so that there's no misunderstanding, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the Metropolitan Police Department 2024 year-to-date crime comparison as of today, May 14th, 2024.
Without objection.
Did you have something you want to add, Mr. Raskin?
Well, but I would just say this. I think, not just with respect to D.C., but with respect to horizontal federalism generally, I think that we should be cautious about looking in other states and seeing that they punish this or that offense less severely than our own state, and thereby call them soft on crime. In the District of Columbia, for example, there is a maximum penalty for armed robbery of 30 years. In the chairman's home state of Kentucky, it's 20 years for armed robbery. Does that make the people of Kentucky soft on crime? Well, I would reject that. I would say that they are responding to whatever they think the various legislative factors are. For unarmed robbery in D.C., it's 15 years. In Kentucky, it's 10 years. So it's 50% higher for both armed robbery and robbery in the District of Columbia than it is in Kentucky.
So under this bill, basically, I mean, the D.C. Council could not even increase penalties without Congress doing it for them, which I think, you know, and this Congress can't even, you know, pass what the heck for lunch, never mind, you know, serious legislation of any kind. Did you want to add one other thing?
Well, I mean, that's what American federalism is about. And the district constituting the seat of government, far from being the colonial plaything of those of us who come from other states, should be accorded the same kind of deference that we accord the other states in terms of them making their judgments. By the way, my staff is finding a whole bunch of carjackings that took place outside of Louisville. There's a town called...
It would be in Louisville. It would be in Louisville. If there are carjackings in Kentucky, they'll be in Louisville.
Do you know of a town called Hebron?
That's the suburb of Cincinnati.
Well, that's not.
Oh, I see. But it's in the state of Kentucky nonetheless, right? It's a suburb of Cincinnati. Okay, well, they found one recently there. It seems like there are some carjackings outside of the border of Louisville, and I'm sure that the people of Louisville would want me to correct that misimpression.
Okay, well, I appreciate your answers to my question. I think this is a joke, quite frankly, that we're doing this. And again, you know, this is par for the course. With that, I yield back.